You make your bed, and then you have to lie in it. That's the way that expression goes. Is that right, Warden? I said, is that right? I will not be ignored. I know you hear me. Perhaps I should shout? Disturb everyone else in here since my good friend the warden will no longer humor me? Oh, can you hear me now? Aren't you a bit close to my cell, Warden? What can you possibly do to me that's worse than what is happening now? I'll be on a carriage ride back to the devil come tomorrow morning. I am prepared to make a wager with you. If you would simply let me regale you with the tale of my misfortune, then I will be satisfied and promise not to disturb you any more. Why you? Well, you are the only one here with no other choice but to listen, except for the other prisoners. No, don't walk away. Come back. I've got a much less practical reason. Since the end of my life is approaching much sooner than anticipated, I need someone to take account of it. A trustworthy person like you is more likely to be believed against the wailing masses, even against my own family. Innocence. Trust me, Warden, I have not been innocent in a very long time. I am very guilty. Guilty of naivete and foolishness. You may want to bring that stool over and sit. I do not wish for you to be distracted while I tell my story. That's perfect. I suppose I should start with the bloodline. Years ago, a witch and a warlock fell in love and were wed. The witch birthed twins, myself and my sister. We all lived in a small village in the woods. Living as supernatural beings, there were certain rules we had to follow regarding magic. While underaged, we were to only practice while supervised. We were only allowed to practice in designated areas, such as school or at home. And the most important rule, never teach magic to mortals. That means people like you, Warden, non-magical beings. For the most part, my childhood was exemplary. We lived in a cozy home in the forest near a river. I'd sometimes sit outside for hours just listening to the rushing water. We went to a small school with some other children who also practiced magic, and we learned to cultivate our powers in a safe and nurturing way. My sister and I were even allowed free rein to go anywhere we wanted in town, as long as we went together. As far as my innocent mind knew, everyone was happy and everything was wonderful. Until one fateful day. Our community leader called a meeting that the whole town was shut down for. The meeting focused solely on a group of outsiders called the Hunters. They hated magic and anything associated with it. Our leader described them as an evil group who wouldn't hesitate to burn down our homes if we let our guard down. Several new rules came into effect that day. School had been about learning and practicing new spells for day-to-day life, such as cooking and cleaning. Now we had mandatory hunter preparation training and drills. The spells we were learning now consisted of ways to defend ourselves against the hunters. My sister and I were no longer allowed to wander about our tiny town without adult supervision. And of course, there was an even greater emphasis on never teaching mortals about magic. We weren't allowed to interact with them at all, in fact. The point had seemed moot for years, as my entire family had never even met a non-magical being. But the community leaders instilled in us that they were masters of trickery and could look like anyone. We eventually started having to identify ourselves by our family lineage as proof that we were witches, if requested by a community leader. In the beginning, the new rules seemed odd, but over the next 5 years, they became normal. By then, I was nearly an adult and had followed all of the rules to the letter out of obedience. But then, suddenly, I was tempted by rebellion. I had been at the market one afternoon and had forgotten to bring a bag with me. A loose piece of fruit slipped out of my arms and someone retrieved it for me. I had never seen anyone so handsome. We spoke only for a brief moment. I had to thank him for catching my errant fruit. When I went home, I thought about him briefly, but pushed him from my mind as I was sure we would never see each other again. Fate showed me just how foolish I was, because after that day, I would never stop seeing him. He showed up at our school and always wanted to be next to me during lessons. I was very annoyed by his behavior, but as my sister would tell me later, my blushing face showed just the opposite. I couldn't help but stare at him from the corner of my eye, knowing he didn't notice me while secretly hoping he would. Our instructor eventually started pairing us together for lessons, and I could tell that this human Adonis was not exactly the brightest flame on the candelabra. I assisted him as much as I could, telling myself it was to protect my own scores and not about him. It wasn't until he started pressing for extra lessons outside of class that I finally stopped lying to myself. I was smitten, and there was no spell that could break it. Are you still with me, Warden? Good. We graduated school eventually and became apprentices of a locksmith. We had to learn to open doors with and without magic. One day, as a trick, I locked him in a room with a tiny snake I had found outside and ordered him to use magic to open the door because it would be the quickest way out. I assumed he'd quit messing about and take magic seriously for once. Instead, he escaped through a window and got us both removed from the apprenticeship. It was then that I learned what I'd spent years ignoring. He wasn't lazy or ignorant. He was mortal. At this point, I should have, at the very least, left him alone and at the very most alerted someone to my discovery. But I was a foolish, lovesick puppy, so I did neither. I made the worst decision I possibly could have made. I followed him home and hid behind his house. I heard loud, angry voices using words like mission and fate. Then the yelling subsided and I heard a soft voice say, love. It was his voice. There was a loud slam, and then he went to his window and told me to come inside. I was taken aback because I had been cloaking myself with a spell, but he somehow sensed I was there. He told me everything. His family was a group of hunters that had been sent to our town to keep an eye on the unlawful use of magic. He taught me that use of magic against a mortal was unlawful and punishable by execution. I had never heard of such a thing. It seemed inconceivable that everything I had been taught most of my life was illegal. He said he'd promised never to hurt me or my family as long as we practiced lawful magic, and if I agreed to keep his secret by teaching him magic. I knew it was against the rules, but apparently everything else I had been taught up to that point was against a different set of rules. It was a very frustrating place to be. So, against my community's wishes, I helped him learn magic and lied to my family about it. This created a constant exhaustion in me. No matter what I was doing, I was deceiving someone, looking them right in the eyes and lying. And I knew it would only be a matter of time before I stumbled on my words. My sister had been casually watching in the background to mine and the boys' activities. She hadn't said a single word, which led me to assume she was ignorant of it the whole time. Until one day she whispered to me as I left to see him again, "Be careful." To this day, I still have no idea if she was the reason we got caught. We were alone in a secluded part of the woods practicing fairly easy magic. I'd thrown an acorn into the air to see if he could hold it up for at least 5 seconds. He was struggling, but getting better at it. A community leader suddenly walked past and just started watching us. We continued as normal so as not to raise suspicion until he walked up to me and told me to stop holding the acorn. I was terrified, so I just let it hit the ground. Then he told the boy to lift the acorn with a spell and stared directly at me so that I couldn't help him. I really hoped he'd just assume that it was nerves or laziness that caused him to forget the spell and he would move on. But he didn't. The leader slammed the boy with lineage questions, the ones that had been drilled into us since childhood, ones we both knew he couldn't answer. Yes, Warden, I'll continue. This is the part where it gets dark. The leader was immediately furious and lifted the boy over his head with magic and demanded he tell him who his parents were. He refused to talk and was held over the river as punishment. I was terrified, but too afraid to do anything for fear of the wrath he would place on me. Then I saw his magical grip slipping. 1 or 2 inches at a time, the boy would get closer to the river. When he screamed out for me and I couldn't stand by anymore and watch, I used my magic to try and save him. I tried pulling him away from the grip of the leader, but I wasn't strong enough. No, he didn't drown. What happened was much worse. 2 magical forces pulling against each other gets very hot, so even if he hadn't been thrown to the ground so forcefully, he still wouldn't have lived. Using magic against a community leader to save a mortal pretending to be a warlock is apparently also a crime punishable by execution. I didn't tell this story as a cautionary tale, though I believe it to be one. I didn't tell it to teach a lesson, though I think it has a lesson. And I didn't tell it to blame anyone for what happened, although there is a lot of blame to go around. I told it because it is my story, Warden. And tomorrow morning, when I am walked to the gallows, someone will have heard it. My community, my family, and everyone I've ever known may have turned against me, but at least one person in this world can see it all through my eyes with my fear and my foolishness. My bed has been well made. No, I'm actually hungry right now. Is it dinner time yet, Warden?